And again, friends, welcome to this workshop, The Bible, the Land, and the Middle East. All right, now I would like to introduce a bit about our workshop leader today. Dorothy Jean Weaver is a professor emerita of New Testament at Eastern Mennonite Seminary, Harrisonburg, Virginia, USA. Her graduate work was on the Gospel of Matthew. Along with many other courses and many other essays, she has thought and written over many years about the Gospel of Matthew as story. She has also been involved over many years in leading study tours and work groups to the Middle East on behalf of Eastern Mennonite Seminary and Virginia Mennonite Missions. Dorothy Jean is a member of Community Mennonite Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and she is ordained by Virginia Mennonite Conference, the Special Ministry of Bible Teaching. So Dorothy, we are so grateful to have you with us today. And without further ado, the floor and the screen is yours.
Okay.
Please.
Well, I will be happy to give this workshop, even if there are only 5 of us here. I think, do you have somebody with you, Cynthia?
Yeah, my husband, Emerson.
Okay, welcome. Welcome, Emerson. If you want to show up, you can show up as well. We're happy for all comers. This is about Christian Zionism. And because of the makeup of this group, I'm going to assume that you know something about what Christian Zionism is. I'm going to read a quote that comes from someone who is not a Christian Zionist, but someone who is trying to explain what Christian Zionism is all about. And it's a very succinct definition. So I think it will be helpful as a way to start our session. This is from Colin Chapman that is quoted in another book. Although Jesus, and I quote here, although Jesus as the Messiah is the fulfillment of all the promises and prophecies of the Old Testament, the promises and prophecies about the land and about biblical Israel remain the same even after his coming and need to be interpreted literally. Because of the promise to Abraham, therefore, the Jewish people have a special divine right to the land for all times. And even if the prophecies about a return to the land were fulfilled in a limited way in the return from the exile in Babylon in 539 BC, they have been fulfilled once again in recent history in the return of the Jews to the land since the 1880s. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and the capture of East Jerusalem in 1967. These events are signs pointing to the second coming. End of quote. That is somebody who is trying to explain what Christian Zionism is. He does not believe this himself, but he's trying to explain it to other people so that they understand what the issue is. The problem with Christian Zionism is obviously that there were other people living in the land in 1948, and almost 750,000 of them were chased out of their homes or left their homes because of fear. By the Israeli, they weren't yet Israelis, but the would-be, the almost Israeli forces, the military forces of the Jewish people. And so the land was divided, the land of Palestine was divided in 1947 or 48. And the problem—
Thank you.
The problem is that the Palestinian people were living in the land in 1948, and they lost their homes. Many of them lost their homes, and many of them became refugees in other countries. And in 1967, there was another war, and then the Palestinians, or the Arab people that went to war with Israel, they lost the war, and the Palestinians they were occupied by the Israeli nation, by the Israeli military. And that has been the case ever since 1967. That is the problem. So Christian Zionism is a belief that says the Israelis, the present day Israelis, deserve to have the land and deserve to be the occupiers because God gave the land to Abraham thousands of years ago. That is the problem. So I actually don't believe that they are reading the scriptures as carefully as they should. And what I plan to do here this evening is to offer my own perspective on both the Old Testament framework and mostly on the New Testament. On New Testament texts that have to do with land or with the people, the Jewish people. So that's what I hope to do in this workshop. I want to start with Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. And I'm starting there because this is the text that Christian Zionists use to say that the land belongs to the Jewish people. And this is Genesis 12, 1 to 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now, that is a statement that we recognize as God's promise of nationhood. He's told to go to, Abraham is told to go to a land, and God is going to make him into a nation. And this is the foundation of Christian Zionism. But we see some other things in the Old Testament as well. In Leviticus, in Leviticus 18, verses 24 to 30, we hear God saying, "Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, the ways that he has described just before. For by all these practices, the nations I am casting out before you have defiled themselves. And God goes on to say that if you do things that defile you, then the land becomes defiled, and I will, this is very graphic language, I will vomit you out of the land. So there is a warning that the people in the land need to be faithful. There is another verse that we find in Leviticus 25:23. And that verse says, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity or forever, for the land is mine. With me, you are but aliens and tenants. So we also learn, even already in the Old Testament, that God is the ultimate owner of the land. The people are not the ultimate owners. So there are statements that make it sound like being in the land is not quite as permanent as Christian Zionists imagine that it is. And throughout the Old Testament, especially in the prophetic books, we find God warning the people that if they are not faithful, there will be judgment. And that does in fact happen. They go into exile. And that's a big piece of the story in the Old Testament. Eventually they come back from exile into the land. And several hundred years later, then, we find the story of Jesus, which is the story of the New Testament. And that's what I want to spend most of my time reflecting on. I would like to start with a parable that Jesus tells in Mark 12. It's also found in Matthew and in Luke. And this is a parable that Jesus tells shortly before his crucifixion. He is in Jerusalem and he is debating with the religious leaders in Jerusalem at the temple. And he tells them a parable. And this parable is about a man who plants a vineyard, and then he goes away. And he puts the vineyard into the care of the tenants, the caretakers for the vineyard. And when the harvest comes, he sends servants back to the tenants so that they can get the harvest. But the tenants do not give the harvest to the servants. They beat them up. They do bad things to them, and then ultimately they kill some of them. And Jesus says at the end of this parable, well, they kill some, and it says he had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent the beloved son to them, and he said, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. And he says, and Jesus says, "What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others." So this is a parable that Jesus tells right before his crucifixion. And it sounds like Jesus is saying in veiled terms that he's telling a story about himself. He is the beloved son, and God has sent him to the Jewish people, and they haven't received him. And the outcome of the story is that the vineyard, which is very often used as an image of Israel itself, the vineyard will be given to others. And the idea that the people of God are in the land and can stay there forever doesn't look very possible. So that's a parable. That's a really important parable that Jesus tells, which tells us that it isn't so clear that the people that are in the land can just stay there forever. I'd like to go from there to looking at some of the books in the New Testament. I'm going to start with the Gospel of Matthew. I think I have a bit of a disaster here in my house. I'm smelling something and my renter has gone away, and I think his thing is beeping. So I am going to need to try to get hold of him to get in touch with him. If you can wait just a minute. Yes, I would like to start with the Gospel of Matthew and look to see what Matthew has to say about land or about the people. And Matthew is a very Jewish gospel. But it starts with a genealogy that is a Jewish genealogy. The genealogy starts with Abraham, and it goes to Jesus the Messiah. And that is the Jewish genealogy. So we know that Matthew is telling a Jewish story. But what is very interesting about the Gospel of Matthew is that while it starts as a very Jewish genealogy, it opens up eventually into a story that includes Gentiles. And the place that the story ends up is with Jesus on a mountain with his disciples. And Jesus says, "Go and make disciples of all the nations." And so it is very clear that Matthew is not focused on bringing people to the land of Israel. The story ends with the disciples going out into all the world and making disciples of all the nations. And that's what we can see from the Gospel of Matthew. And it clearly does not focus on bringing people into the land of Israel and keeping them there and making land an important part of their faith. Instead, they are to make disciples of Jesus. And Jesus is the one in focus. So that's a tiny picture of the Gospel of Matthew. If we go to the Gospel of Luke, we see something, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, we see something that is similar to that. The Gospel of Luke is one that begins in Jerusalem. Things are happening in Jerusalem at the beginning of the Gospel. And at the end of the Gospel, Jesus ascends. Jesus and his disciples are on the Mount of Olives. And Jesus ascends to heaven from the Mount of Olives. And it says that the disciples go back to Jerusalem. And they stay there and they worship in the temple. So that might make it sound like Jerusalem is a very important place. But in fact, there are some things that change that picture. In Luke 4, we have Jesus going to Nazareth. And Jesus preaches in the synagogue in Nazareth. He reads the scripture and he pronounces what the scripture means. And he says that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. And there are other phrases there. I don't have it in front of me, but the people are happy with his words. They like it. They know that he is their hometown boy. But then Jesus starts telling stories. And the stories he tells are about God healing people who are not Jewish. In fact, one of them, Naaman, is the head of the enemy army, which makes things really bad so far as the people of Nazareth are concerned. And they get very angry. And they take Jesus and they want to take Jesus and throw him off a cliff. But Jesus walks away. And this story tells us that God has interests far beyond Israel. Even with Israel's enemies. And the story of Emmaus at the end of the gospel. The disciples who are going to Emmaus. They say to Jesus, let me just get it here. Jesus asks these people walking along the road what they're talking about. And they say, they're talking about what happened in Jerusalem. And they're talking about what happened to Jesus of Nazareth, who was condemned and killed. And they say, we hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. We thought that he was the one that was going to give us our land back and be our leader. And Jesus gives them a long Bible study on scriptures that have to do with him. So it's clear that Jesus doesn't believe from this story that we're told. He doesn't believe that the important thing is the land of Israel and taking it back or being successful in battle against their enemies, the Romans. Then at the beginning of the book of Acts, which is connected to Luke, we have the disciples coming to Jesus. This is after the resurrection. The disciples come to Jesus and they ask him, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus says, basically, he says, you've got the wrong idea. He says, it's not for you to know the times or the periods that God has set by his authority. but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So once again, it takes the land of Israel right out of the picture, or it is not the end of the story. The important thing in the New Testament is not the land of Israel. So that's a bit of what we see at the beginning of Acts. But then in chapter 2 of Acts, we see all the world, Jewish people from all the world coming to Jerusalem for Pentecost. And the Holy Spirit shows up at Pentecost. And all of these people, they're from all of the known world at that time. And they presumably go back home to their countries, and they take the story of Jesus with them. And then in the rest of the book of Acts, we see the good news about Jesus going out to Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth. And most of that is with Paul. Much of the story of the book of Acts is about Paul and his journeys. So that's what we see in the book of in Luke and Acts, and the story does not end in the land or in Jerusalem. If we look at the Gospel of John, we discover that John tells his story of Jesus in a very different way. And what John does throughout his gospel is to show that Jesus is the replacement of the Jewish religious customs and festivals and holidays. Jesus and most importantly, in chapter 2, Jesus is the one who replaces the temple itself. John tells the story of the cleansing of the temple at the very beginning of his gospel. And at the end of that story, John tells us that Jesus is talking about the temple of his body. So that Jesus himself becomes the access to God, rather than needing to go through the temple. Jesus fulfills many other festivals and customs. Also in chapter 6, Jesus talks about himself as the bread and the wine. Jesus feeds a multitude. And then he starts talking to them about how he is the bread of life. And that people need to eat his flesh and drink his blood. So Jesus becomes the replacement for the Passover. And Jesus is the one who replaces the Jewish customs, so that it is not the important thing in John's gospel for people to come to Jerusalem and to the temple. And when Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman, she says, well, your people say that Jerusalem is the place to worship, and our people say that Mount Gerizim is the place to worship. And Jesus says to her, you know, it's not either Gerizim or Jerusalem, but people that want to worship God must worship in spirit and truth. So John takes the picture of the land, or takes the land out of the picture altogether by saying it's not Jerusalem and it's not Gerizim. What we see in Paul's writings, just one concept that we see in Paul's writings, and this comes from his letters to the Corinthians. We see that Paul views the believers themselves as the temple of God. This is another idea. In 1 Corinthians 3:16 and 17, Paul says, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. And he says the same thing in other places, in both 1 Corinthians and in 2 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians, he talks about God dwelling within God's people. So the idea is very different from the idea of Jerusalem being the important place and the temple, which was still standing during Paul's time, the temple being the most crucial thing. So that's what a little of what we see in Paul. In Hebrews, we see something else. In Hebrews, we see a comparison of two things. On the one hand, the writer to the Hebrews is talking about this is the way things were in your worship. This is the way it was with the priest, the high priest, and this is the things that you needed to do. But now he says, now Jesus is the true high priest. And he is the one that is more important now than the old customs that you had. And so the old things give way to new things with Jesus. And also in Hebrews, we see a reference to the heavenly city, to Jerusalem as the heavenly city, which is something that is new, that is not the earthly Jerusalem that the people then knew. So he talks about Jerusalem as a heavenly city. The same thing happens in the book of Revelation. And here there is reference to the holy city where they crucified Jesus. And witnesses are killed there. Witnesses for Jesus are killed there. But ultimately, at the end of the book of Revelation, John the Revelator talks about the heavenly Jerusalem, which is going to come down from heaven and from God. It's going to descend from God. So there's something very different than the earthly Jerusalem that the earliest followers of Jesus knew. So there are many clues in the New Testament that tell us that land is not the important thing, but that the important thing is now Jesus. And that, I think, is a basic way to understand the New Testament. To say that the focus is no longer on getting onto a particular piece of land and staying there. The focus is on becoming disciples of Jesus and on going throughout the entire world to make disciples. So that is a bit of what I would have to offer by way of a response to the Christian Zionist perspective that says, even though Jesus came, the land is still the most important thing, and we should have the land and keep it forever. And we should be occupiers of the people that are in the land. So that is a bit of what I would have to offer. I would be happy to engage in conversation if any of you have comments or questions. And if you do, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. In 1947, I assume some of the people in Palestine were Palestinian Christians.
Yes.
Yes. And I guess people didn't really pay much attention to that. Or letting Jews go back to Israel was a solution of a problem that the Europeans came up with, I guess, largely. And but it seems to me today, Israelis that live in Israel would not really use that as very much of a reason why they're there. Now they're just there because they're there.
Well,
and there seem to have dug in pretty hard to stay there. And this Christians in the U.S. that support this are supporting anything the US government wants to do to help Israel, and they're not too fussy about what that is something that they should support. I'm talking about conservative Christians who would hold this, that supporting Israel is helping God's will come to earth or something. Is the sense of place, I mean, if you look at the other places in the New Testament, the Jews were living all over the place. It doesn't look like they were looking to Jerusalem for everything that was good and longing to go back there. They were established in throughout the Roman Empire and Greece and so on. So what today? I mean, it seems to me that these things that might have been pretty vivid in people's imaginations 75 years ago aren't vivid anymore. Is this going to ever change, or is it just something that is going to continue without interruption?
You're asking
the drive to occupy or to stay in Israel, no matter what it costs.
You're asking whether that's going to change or stay the same.
Do you think that there's any forces in the world that would make it, say, less tenable for Israel to continue to dominate the region?
The one force in the world that could change this situation is the United States. And that is one of the reasons that I find it so important to talk to Americans about this situation, because we are responsible. Our tax dollars pay for the occupation of the Palestinian people. And it became very clear to me in 2000, when I was in Bethlehem at the beginning of the Second Intifada, which was a war between Israel and Palestine. It became very clear to me that my tax dollars were paying for the bombs that the Israelis dropped on Palestinian locations and the shells that they sent against Palestinian towns. That became very clear to me. So I think it's really important for us as Americans, and I say that advisedly, I say that intentionally, to us as Americans, regardless of who is listening in, it is our major responsibility to talk to our government, because our government is the one government in the entire world that could change this situation if they chose to do so.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much, first of all, Dorothy, for your presentation and very enlightening, engaging in these very engaging topics. Yeah, I mean, your presentation, Dorothy, reminds me of Walter Brueggemann's book many years ago. I think I read. The title is Chosen with question mark. I think he said about the conflict in Palestine and Israel actually is not about, secondarily about security and human rights, but primarily it's about the land. And you're right. And you also mentioned about the losing nature of the land, even in the Old Testament, right? Like in Deuteronomy and prophecies, there are many texts, even in the Old Testament, that saying that the land actually is not like rigid. It's losing. It's as a losing nature. I think what I really interested to ask Dorothy is about how Christian and Jewish see the land, because I think as a Christian we tend to see the issues of the land from spiritual perspective. Sometimes you over spiritualize it, while for the Jewish people they tend to materialize it. So I want to hear more about this, Dorothy, because I think both perspective can bring problems. Like in the US, for example, the problem with the Native Americans' land, for example, is coming from the European Christians when they came here and they over spiritualized the land, right? I mean, both perspective is creating problem. I just wanted to hear more about maybe you have more perspective on that. Thank you.
Can you reframe? Stay on. Can you reframe your question? I'm not quite sure what to respond to.
It's more about Christian perspective that more spiritual when they see the issues of the land, and the Jewish people when they see the issue. Sorry?
You mean in Israel?
I mean Christians, because like in Indonesia, many Christians when they read the Old Testament and when they read about the land, they tend to read that in spiritual perspective instead of.
They tend to think of it as
spiritual land.
Okay.
Instead of material land, right? And it's kind of different with the Israelites, and I think that's why Israelites tend to like hold strongly on this in this particular land. So I don't know, but I just curious about your perspective on that.
Well, yeah, let me just start by saying that one observation that I make is that when people travel to the Holy Land, we didn't even use the term Holy Land, but that was in the title of the workshop. When people travel to the Holy Land, they often expect it to be something that looks like the first century. And I think that might be their first big surprise, that this is a modern country. And yeah, I'm not quite sure how to pick up on your spiritual concept. Maybe you can explain it a little bit more. But the reality is that Israel, the country of Israel, is occupying an entire population of people that also live on that same land. And that is a problem. That is a huge problem. And this is not a kind or gentle occupation. There is a lot of injustice that is happening. The very best way to explain it to people in the United States right now would be to say that it is like the situation that we have with the African American community, where injustice is simply baked into the system. Palestinians are kept from movement. They cannot get through checkpoints. Palestinian people have died because they couldn't get to health care from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, let us say. I know someone whose father died because he couldn't get timely care in a hospital. He was kept at the checkpoint far too long. And when he got to the hospital, the nurse or the doctor said to his wife, "Why did you wait so long?" The answer, of course, was they couldn't get through the checkpoint. People's houses, Palestinians' houses, are demolished. You have to have a permit to build a house. And if you don't have the permit, they will come and destroy your house. The catch is that the Israelis don't very often give permits to build houses. So many Palestinians have lost their homes. So their houses are destroyed. And sometimes settlers who are Israelis that live in the West Bank, which is the Palestinian area, settlers sometimes do things like destroy people's crops or cut down their olive trees or put poison in their wells to poison their animals. All kinds of things happen in this situation of occupation, and none of them are pretty. None of them are just. So the Palestinians are looking for justice, while the Israelis are looking for security. But the fact of the matter is that those two things have to go together. The Israelis will never find full security until the Palestinians find justice. It's a very difficult situation. But we need to start by reading the New Testament and understanding that Christian Zionism is not a healthy perspective.
But the Jewish population of Israel, they don't read the New Testament and they don't care.
They don't. You're right about that. They do not read the New Testament. But even if they read their Old Testament, if they read their Bible, which isn't old to them, even if they read their Bible, as we noted, there is plenty of evidence to say that the people living in the land need to be faithful. And so whether you read the Old Testament or whether you read the New Testament, there is no room for one group of people to oppress another group of people.
And it almost seems like the Jews of Israel treat the Palestinians worse today than would have been the case 2,500 years ago. I mean, they did get along with their neighbors more or less, at least most of the time. and they never tried to erase them, I guess, as they seem to want to do today.
Mhm. Well, it's a challenging situation. And right now, I think the situation is as bad as it has been at least over the past 25 years, which is how long I have been traveling there. And people, I think Palestinians are very discouraged.
Have you been to the Nazareth village that's in, is that a project of MCC or in Israel?
Nazareth Village is not a project of the Mennonite Central Committee. It was started up in conjunction with the Mennonite Board of Missions, with assistance from the Mennonite Board of Missions from the United States. But it is a wonderful location which recreates ancient Nazareth. And if you want to see what the country looked like in the first century, you need to go to Nazareth Village. And I just came back about a month ago, little more than a month ago, from a work group where I took a group of people to Nazareth and Bethlehem. And at Nazareth Village, we dressed like first century people. And we worked on, as they say, on the land. We worked out in the village. And the tourists came through, and there we were, looking like first century Nazareth people. So that is something that one can do, and that I can help you to do if you are interested. You gave me that opportunity to give you an invitation.
Well, I asked partly because you had mentioned that people go there expecting to see Israel like it was in the first century. And so I was curious about why we are, in that case, are satisfying that need.
Yeah,
that want that people have.
Yeah, that is the one place that you can go that really looks like a first century village. And it's delightful. If you want to, if anybody that is here tonight or that listens to this video wants to, you can go online to Nazareth Village. I'm sure they have a really good website. So just try going to Nazareth Village and you can see what it looks like.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, we are less than 10 minutes now. I think our translator Diego has a good question for you, Dorothy.
Okay.
Please, Diego.
I don't have a question per se. It's just I think it was very interesting to see the point of view from the Bible, because most of the time it is important to as Christians to see the gospel and to go into the scriptures and kind of like we can talk about these things when there's people who can use the Bible for evil purposes or just like trying to make their case. their cases. And so I think it's important, these illustrations. I am a student of the seminary, and we're looking at the New Testament and all the books, and what you did through Matthew and Marcus and John, it just reminds me of all these things. And I appreciate really this workshop, because it gives me ideas of how counteract these thoughts that some people might have about how they see the land and how they see these conflicts, which I think I'm not going to say numbers, but I think most of the people don't understand the conflict and what it is about. And what you say about United States having a big responsibility, I think that's what it is, because many a lot of money goes into that war and supporting all of these terrible things that are happening, and that's not right. That is not just. And so I wanted to point out that. Thank you very much for that, Dorothy.
It is not just, and it is the special challenge of us as American Christians to both understand what is going on there and to respond as best we can to our legislators, to our government. And in fact, a few people from the group that just came back from Nazareth and Bethlehem, a few of us, I think maybe 4 of us, will be going to Washington, D.C. in August to go to the offices of our legislators on Capitol Hill, and also to go to the State Department and to say out loud the things that we witnessed and experienced, the stories that people told us, what we saw with our own eyes, to help them begin to understand what is really going on there. I hope that it has at least given you some ideas of what it means to read the New Testament texts with Jesus in mind and not the land. And I think that will be a big help to our reading of the New Testament, if we keep in mind that we are not seeking. There is nowhere in the New Testament where we are seeking to make our claim on a particular piece of land and sit there and chase away other people that want to be there. That's not at all what the New Testament is about. It is about proclaiming the good news of Jesus. And in order to do that, there are many pointers that we have to go as far as the ends of the earth to do that. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
And thanks for your
Thank you.
questions and comments. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you. And
thank you, Dorothy, very much.
Thank you for all. And yeah, I think we can end our session. And again, thank you, Dorothy, for this very engaging and enlightening presentation about the conflict in the Middle East and the biblical background behind it. And also, thank you so much, friends, for attending this session, and see you at the other workshops during the World Conference. Bye.
Thank you to Diego for your work in translating.
Thank you, Diego. Yes. Thank you.
I have no idea how fast or slow one needs to speak for a translator.
No, it was fine. You did a great job. I mean, you were giving me some time to just like think about the words, but it went well, I think. Okay. Hopefully people will be able to see this and hear my voice. I don't know how is that gonna play out, but
okay.
Yeah, we'll see.
Thank you so
but thank
much.
you, Dorothy, for everything. Yeah.